Museum and Study Center. We are so pleased to welcome you all to the continuation of our series, All People Have Voice. The vision behind the series is to spotlight different voices and perspectives in order to enrich our understanding of one another and to celebrate the diversity of our community. The mission of the El Paso Holocaust Museum is to teach the history of the Holocaust in order to combat prejudice and intolerance through education, community outreach, and cultural activities. We strongly believe that it is imperative to our mission to connect the history with the contemporary, to highlight situations and issues today that can lead to the division and intolerance of hate. As we know from history, discrimination starts with ignorance, lack of understanding of one another, and unwillingness to try to bridge that gap. It is very slippery slope from ignorance to prejudice. From prejudice to hate to violence. So this series is about celebrating what makes our community, what makes our country special, diverse voices, a range of experience and backgrounds. Appreciating what makes each person unique can go a long way in the right direction. We hope you enjoy our lecture tonight, which will be presented by Dr. Selfa Chew. Following the presentation, there will be the opportunity to place your questions in the Q&A box down below, where we will be able to convey your questions to Dr. Chew. We ask participants to remain respectful and courteous when writing your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And now it is with great pleasure to welcome our discussion moderator this evening, Dr. Selfa Chew. Dr. Selfa Chew holds a PhD in Borderland history from the University of Texas at El Paso. She earned her bachelor's degree in communication science from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and her MFA in creative writing from UTEP. She studied fine arts at Pasadena City College and Art Center College of Design. Dr. Chew has served as editor of Border Senses Literary Review and coordinated the Mexican Contemporary Literature Conference and Journal until 2012. She is a Smithsonian Fellow in the Latino Image Representations and Interpretations Institute. Her work has been published in Peru, Spain, Argentina, Mexico, China, the Netherlands, and the United States. She has received the Voices of Sol Award by the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in 2015 for her work as a playwright. Dr. Chew's research focuses on racial relations, the Asian and African diaspora, and World War II. She is currently an associate professor of instruction at the Department of History and the African American Studies program. Her latest publication, Uprooting Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II, and the U.S. Borderlands, Mexico Borderlands, was awarded the International Latino Award and the Southwest Book Award in 2017. So it is with great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Selfa Chew.
Thank you very much. It is an honor for me to be invited to share with you my my research and my passion. I am very worried about what is happening currently in the United States and other parts of the world. And I know that this event is very important, but we don't have enough time to discuss in detail or to include everything that I would like to share with you tonight, but at least it's going to be a reason for us to research further and to try to gather more information and to also reflect on our role in not only the discussion, but in the struggle against social injustice and racism and other isms, right? So I'm gonna share with you my PowerPoint presentation, and let's hope that technology is on my side today. All right, I think it is. Okay, so what I want to make clear is that Asia is the world's largest continent. And with that, we need to acknowledge that there is a great diversity in that population that we term Asian America or Asian Americans. So right now there are about 4 billion persons in this continent, and that covers a huge area with multiple languages, religions, ethnicities, ecological systems, traditions, natural resources, histories, and economic and political systems. So it is indeed very, very unfair to characterize a person by notions that we learned from different sources, but that are not applicable to all persons of Asian descent, right? Also, I would like us to reflect on the reasons for immigration. Why do we immigrate? Why do persons from Asia immigrate to other parts of the world, not only to the United States? And there are very, very different reasons, as diverse as the population that I just tried to describe in my previous slide, right? War, love, ideological differences, state violence or state prosecution, enslavement, as we remember African American persons do have ancestors who were enslaved, or we do have persons who were enslaved in different social groups in the United States. Or we also immigrate because we would like to get a type of education that is not offered in our country, and so on, right? So there are many different reasons for immigration. Nevertheless, in the United States, we need to acknowledge that the history of this country is very much rooted on racist processes, and we cannot help but think about how indigenous populations were displaced, how African persons were enslaved, kidnapped from Africa, and trafficked into the United States. Asian populations were also displaced through colonization and different types of interventions. And at some point, some sectors, some social sectors in some areas of Asia were also enslaved and forced to immigrate to the American continent, and so on, right? There are different types of social sectors that have historically been subjected to racism, which is a system of advantages based on racial classifications, and it implies racial power, hierarchies. Racism is structural, it is institutional, it's not exclusively a personal decision. We can benefit from racism if we are part of the class, the social sector that is in power within a racist system. And as I stated before, this process of building the nation is very much rooted in racism. And we can also see it through the Naturalization Act of 1790, which stated that only free white persons could apply for naturalization, could become citizens of the United States. And we know that with citizenship, we acquire rights, what we call today civil or in human rights. So it's very important to be able to naturalize in any country. And so when persons of Asian descent or persons of Asian origin were banned from applying for naturalization, they were segregated, they were discriminated by law. So a system of racism was legal in the United States and was anti-Asian also in its origins. In terms of Asian immigration, the immigration is can be traced to very early periods of colonization of the Americas, and we know that Spain as an empire conquered the Philippines, and through the Philippines they also forced persons from Filipinas and other areas of Asia to immigrate into New Spain as enslaved persons. And so immediately a type of mestizaje, hybridism, or family forming of persons from different ethnicities gave way to an Asian foundation also of the Americas. And so when the Spanish colonial power extended itself over what we know today as the United States borderlands, persons of Asian descent actually were with the colonizers of this area. But furthermore, in the United States, we have also different types of immigration from Asia. But the thing is, or the relationship that these different groups of immigration took place is founded on relations of power, right? When Spain transferred persons from Asia, it did so in a way that they were disadvantaged because they were enslaved or because they were racialized. So they occupied an inferior position within the Americas already. And then in the United States, the relationship of the United States with the places of origin of Asian immigrants was also one of hierarchies, and that's why we have by 1850 a Barnum exhibit, which is reflecting the popular culture of the time, including Chinese women, which were exhibited as exotic curiosities. And so this otherization, seeing Asian men and women, but particularly women, as exotic, as the other, as strange creatures, is presented as an attraction in a circus environment. So dehumanization takes place in this type of exhibits. And then we also have different groups that are placed in inferior positions, interacting with other social groups, and their history is also interwoven with that of persons of Asian descent. So after the Civil War, we can acknowledge that enslavement was abolished, right? But then when this type of extraction of labor, this type of abuse of a particular social group is not legal anymore, then Chinese immigration becomes attractive for the investors in the industries that are being developed, particularly in the land that has recently been taken from Mexico, what is now the Southwest, and a connection between the different areas of the United States needs the construction of a railroad and needs also to develop agriculture and to develop the mining industry. And that's how persons from China are seen as desirable laborers to replace the work of an enslaved person in the United States. And so these are only three of the industries in which they are incorporated into, which is sugar, mining, and the railroads. Now, there is another area in the United States in which is also a place of immigration, very, very important for the United States. Even when Hawaii is not yet annexed to the United States, Hawaii is producing goods for this country. And in 1866, we have already an important group of Japanese immigrants. 1900 Okinawa, which is considered part of Japan, but it represents an ethnicity in its own, is also a strong presence in Hawaii. And later, Korean immigrants arrived in Hawaii, as well as Filipinos and other persons from Asia. Now, what I would like us to remember is that, once again, the position of the United States in relation to the places of origin is going to determine the kind of protection that Asian immigrants are going to have in this country. And since Japan, for example, this is only one example, Japan was opened through violence to contact with the United States and other European powers. Japanese immigrants in Hawaii are left with almost null protection, and not only because of their classification as Japanese or Okinawan, but also because of their economic function in Hawaii. In other words, they are laborers, and as laborers, they are considered disposable, a disposable social sector in Hawaii. They are not as respected as the merchants or as the scholars or as the students who come to the United States with some cultural or financial capital. So the type of issues that persons of Asian descent face has to do not only with their place of origin, but also with their economic class, with their gender, with their religion, with their phenotype, and so on. It has always been complex, and it is still reflecting that very diverse population and place in a global order. As I mentioned before, Asia is very diverse and large, and in the United States, Asian populations tend to be stereotyped and also lumped into a very, very broad classifications. For example, what we call the Syrian immigration in reality reflects immigration from different areas from Asia. And at the end of the 19th century, we have persons who did immigrate from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, among other countries, nevertheless, they all are classified as Syrian. And by the way, one pretty interesting fact that I learned recently is that Private Nathan Badin was classified as a Syrian immigrant, and he was actually killed in 1776 when he was fighting with the independentists in what became the United States. So he is one founder of the United States. And well, this is a picture of a family in Manhattan. So Asian immigration did alter, right? Did paint a very changing demographic landscape in the United States. It enriched all areas of the United States, not only the West or not only the East, but immigrants tended to go to various places in the United States, including El Paso. All right. So in talking about differences, class is one factor that actually affected the way in which white Americans related to Asian Americans or Asian immigrants. And of course, poor people, laborers, will always be more exposed to state violence or to mob violence, to racist violence, to all types of violence. And I do have several examples of how laborers in the United States did actually try to organize themselves, did actually try to obtain better labor conditions. And their organization into unions and presenting a unified front as workers may well affect also the way in which the investors in the industries in which they worked cultivated racism. Racism did actually benefited the employers of Asian and Asian American workers because other racialized or other impoverished workers could blame Asian Americans for their salaries or their working conditions instead of acknowledging that the source of exploitation was coming from other places other than the Asian and Asian American workers. So these are three different strikes or labor movements. Japanese workers in May 9, 1909, and then Filipino workers, and then in 1965, and then Chinese railroad workers in 1867. And very important, Asian American women have always also presented resistance to exploitation. One excellent example of this type of organization is the Chinese Ladies Garments Workers Union Local 361, which did stage a strike in 1938 in California. And usually we learn about European, Eastern European, mainly workers, female workers who did take important roles in the formation of union or in the labor movement. but very rarely we learn about the efforts of female Asian workers. Nevertheless, this is only one example of different attempts to attain better working conditions. And just as in the labor movement, Asian Americans, Asian immigrants have participated in the civil rights movements and other type of rights movements facing an anti-Asian racism. So once again, racism is not just an individual choice to mistreat a person or a group of persons. It is structural, it is socially acceptable, and it is supported by laws. So it is socially constructed. As a community, we sanction it, or we accept it, we approve it when we do not oppose it. And it is expressed through different media and in different social sectors, right? Such as unions, Chinese, or and in general Asian workers had to work against the racism that was present in the unions. They were not accepted in them, or they were actively subjected to violence by specific unions in the United States. In school, segregation applied to children of Asian descent, and also churches not only have been segregated, but when segregated became illegal, still persons of Asian descent find very difficult to be hired or to be assigned to integrated or diverse churches. And so they are guided into working exclusively for churches that are established in Asian neighborhoods. Of course, in terms of immigration, I'm going to describe different efforts, legal efforts to prevent persons of Asian descent from coming into the United States or becoming citizens of this country, and so on, right? Shopping, getting housing, high quality housing, and even marrying with the person that we love has also been a process that has been controlled by the state through anti-miscegenation laws, but also through social practices or well, through even jokes, conversations, suggestions that prevent persons of Asian descent from electing freely their spouses. Okay, once again, one foundational racist law is the Naturalization Law of 1790. But as persons of Asian descent arrived in larger numbers into the United States, some policies and some laws were instituted without a racist language. And that is very important to understand how while anti-Asian racism is legal or has been legal, there are also other mechanisms through which the laws were meant to be applied against persons of Asian descent, although the language in which they were constructed is not particularly racist or anti-Asian. So a law can be racist not only in its language, but also in its application.
In 1854, through the People versus Hall case, persons of Asian descent were prevented from being witnesses in court, which means they were left without any protection, because if they were victims of violence or theft or any other abuse by a white person, they could not report. They could not go to court because they could not even narrate what happened to them. And in 1875, the Page Act is one of the first immigration laws that applied to persons of Asian descent, but particularly women. Women as Asian women, Chinese women as suspect of immorality. So this is one foundational immigration law that prevented the entrance of persons of Asian descent, women particularly, into the United States. All right, so we have other local and federal laws. In 1880, the California Civil Code did state that miscegenation, which means mixing, right? The mixing of persons who had different racial classifications was banned. And until then, it had not included specifically Mongolians, but after 1880, persons of Asian descent were not allowed to intermarry, to marry particularly white persons. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first openly racist immigration law. Now, why is this happening? Whereas before, Chinese laborers were highly desirable because they were exploited, because they were disposable too. By 1880, labor movements by European workers or workers of European descent have made a political campaign successful against the Chinese workers in particular. And also by 1880, the railroad lines that were dreamt by the United States as a nation was practically concluded, or a large portion of it was already completed. So Chinese immigrant labor was not wanted anymore, and they became, or Chinese immigrants became, political pawns through which those persons who wanted to promote themselves as candidates in elections did express anti-Asian racism to earn the votes of those who could vote. And remember again that while European immigrants could vote because they were accepted as desirable citizens of the United States, Asian immigrants were banned, could not become citizens, therefore they could not vote, therefore politicians did not have to appeal to them as active participants in the United States politics, right? And then a very, very important piece of information for us as residents of the border is the creation of the Border Patrol as a group of mounted guards in El Paso, Texas, did patrol the area in search of Chinese immigrants, not Mexican, undocumented immigrants, but Chinese undocumented immigrants. And of course, there were other type of immigrants, the Japanese immigrants, and mainly, but there were other sectors in Asia that immigrants originated from in El Paso, Texas. So any anti-immigrant action or a strategy that was implemented at the beginning of the 20th century was actually originated in an anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese movement in the United States. Now, labor has been substituted in the United States through different types of immigration, or even migration, right? Whereas African Americans were substituted in the labor in the South West mainly, but not totally, of course, right? Mainly by Chinese workers. Then Japanese workers arrived in the Southwest when Chinese workers were expulsed or were discouraged from remaining in the United States. All right, I hope I have many questions so we can expand on these ideas. And all right, so this notion of Asian Americans or Asian immigrants as permanent foreigners is not really originated in difference in religion, difference in culture, difference in language, right? The idea developed out of the prohibition of naturalization. If they cannot be citizens, they will be the eternal, the permanent foreigners. They did not actually become integrated into the United States society because they were legally banned from becoming part of the nation's culture and political civic life. And so after the Chinese Exclusion Act, we have the Gentleman's Agreement, which was signed with the Japanese government in 1907. And it actually was a Japanese exclusion policy, but the United States government and the Japanese government agreed on Japan withholding passports and controlling the controlling immigration from Japan to the United States. In other words, the United States allowed the Japanese government to preserve some type of dignity, and it did not ban Japanese immigration as it had done with Chinese immigrants. That gentleman's agreement had some exclusion, right? Or some, well, from the United States point of view, inclusion. And as I said, economic class has always been a factor in the quality of life of immigrants in the United States. And so Chinese and Japanese and Korean and any other person of Asian origin in the United States with a financial means or could always obtain a permit to establish themselves in the United States, or at least to open a business, a place, or attend a school. And women in this type of documents could also immigrate if they were spouses or fiancés of citizens of the United States or documented immigrants with permission in the United States. But the Page Act did actually made it difficult, in the experience of immigrating into the United States as an Asian woman was not a dignified process, because suspicion of coming into the United States for prostitution aims was always part of the long interrogation of Asian women in ports of entrance in the United States. Now, once again, the legal system of the United States could present acts or laws that were not openly anti-Asian. By the California Alien Land Law, which was replicated in other sites of the United States, stated that aliens ineligible for citizenship could not acquire land. And so who were the aliens ineligible for citizenship? Well, in California were persons of Asian descent. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese immigrants who had arrived in the southwest of the United States as laborers had already amassed, through their hard work, enough capital or collective capital, if not individual, to acquire land. And so an instrument to prevent them from social mobility was the California Alien Land Law. And in 1970, the Immigration Act of that year not only made Chinese and Japanese immigration difficult, but it included already other areas of Asia that were barred, were banned from sending or allowing their populations to enter the United States. And India is one of them, but there were other areas in Asia that were now overtly listed in the 1917 Immigration Act. So the United States, the demographics are engineered by this type of acts. There is nothing casual about the way in which ethnicities are represented in the United States. And in 1924, again, the Immigration Act reminds Asian persons that they are excluded from admission in the United States because they are simply ineligible for citizenship. All right. I hope I have time to go through all the material that I have here. In the Borderlands, we have an exception to the Chinese Exclusion Act that I would like to mention here, and it's the Pershing expedition, which took place in 1916, and through which Chinese merchants in Mexico, Chinese immigrants who assisted the Pershing expedition, were allowed into the United States with General Pershing, and were allowed to also stay in the United States as long as they worked for the United States Army. And I'm not clear about their position with the United States Army, but I don't think they were actually integrated into the United States Army, but they were working as an ancillary laborers. All right. On the other side of the border, there is also, or we can find also, a process of anti-Asian racism that has not been acknowledged. Nevertheless, even today, persons in Latin America tend to deny that there is anti-Asian racism or any racism at all. But in fact, Asian immigrants did face different projects that were violent in different periods of the history of Latin America. Nevertheless, Asian immigrants were making very, very strong efforts to integrate themselves into the social processes of Latin America. And an example, during the Mexican Revolution, Kingo, Nonaka was very much part of the revolutionary band or the revolutionary faction of the Civil War at the beginning of the 20th century. But in general, the Mexican Revolution caused persons of Asian descent to immigrate into the United States. And I want to mention Erlinda Chew. We share the same last name. Erlinda Chew, a woman of Chinese descent, did assisted Chinese immigrants and other immigrants to acquire a legal status as residents of the United States during the Mexican Revolution. So she was an immigration attorney without the formal training, but a very, very efficient advocate of the Asian Mexican community in the United States. Now, I would like to also mention that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement, immigrants from Asia tended to go to Latin America with the hope to cross the border. And some of them, as we saw with the Pershing expedition and also with the efforts of Erlinda Chew, did actually become documented immigrants, and some of them did cross undocumented in this country. All right, popular culture has to be acknowledged also as a factor of the violence that has been practiced in the United States. It does fit stereotypes. It does fit the notion that persons of Asian descent are permanent foreigners and that they do share very, very negative characteristics that are false, that are mythic, but nevertheless are tend to be part of and parcel of the popular culture in the United States. And I'm gonna try to go faster at a faster pace because I know that time is of essence here. I wanted to mention through this slide the importance of Filipino immigration in the United States. Filipino immigration, as I said, started in the 17th century with the extension of the Spanish Empire, but also it became important in the United States because of the control that the United States acquired through the war against Spain and then against the Filipino independentists at the beginning of the 20th century. So being controlled by the United States, is only natural to think that the United States is going to offer opportunities for persons in Filipina to improve the quality of their lives. Nevertheless, as they arrived in the United States, they found an anti-Asian environment, the prohibition to marry, into other racialized or white groups. And so Filipino immigrants, as well as other persons of Asian descent, had to actually go to other places other than their places of residence to be able to marry Mexican women or women of other racial classifications, right? But they actually were very, very important in the United States as they contributed through their labor, but also through the organization of laborers into unions. Filipino workers, we may remember, were very, very much part of the farm workers movement in California. And actually, we can create them with the very strong initial struggle for labor rights in that place. Okay, violence, they were subjected also to violence, but by mobs, which were actively trying to segregate Filipino persons, particularly men, from white women. And we got to my target in terms of research, which is the experience of the Japanese Americans during the Second Great War. And we are very familiar with what is termed the displacement of the Japanese American population during the Second Great War. But what we do not often reflect on is that this incarceration program is the result of anti-Asian racism. We tend to see it just as the result of the war in the military attack of the Japanese government on a base in the annexed territory of Hawaii. Nevertheless, the incarceration of persons of Japanese in the United States took place as mass movement, while German and Italian residents of the United States or persons of Italian and German descent were processed on individual basis. And in the long run, we can safely state that Japanese immigrants and Japanese American persons proved not to be spies, not to be violent, not to conspire against the United States government or population. But in any case, as I said, this incarceration, this massive incarceration, is just part of the long history of anti-Asian racism and control of this social group. And not only Japanese American or Japanese immigrants in the United States were incarcerated, but the United States government, the Department of State, actively sought to kidnap practically persons of Japanese descent who were citizens or legal documented residents of Latin American countries, and they were transported into the United States. Their passports were removed. from them, and they were declared illegal aliens as they entered the United States against their will. I have to say that the Second Great War ended in 1945, but the program, the incarceration program in the case of Latin American Japanese persons did stayed until 1948. And when they were released, they were forced to work in farms for next to nothing because the farms became the guards or the guarantors of Latin American Japanese forced immigrants because the Latin American countries that they were from did not accept their re-entrance into their territory, while the United States refused to accept any responsibility for the removal from their places of origin. While incarcerated in the concentration camps, the Renunciation Act of 1944 did try to force Japanese Americans, those who were born in the United States and who were second or third generation in the United States, to renounce to their citizenship in order to remain with their parents who were not citizens of the United States because the law prevented them from attaining citizenship. I think that I have some minutes left, so I'm just gonna go quickly again. The relationship of women of Asian origin to the occupying forces in their countries, or the army presence in different countries of Asia is very interesting, because although they become spouses of American citizens, their entrance in the United States has always been a difficult matter. But particularly after the Second Great War, for Japanese women, because of the racist laws in place in the United States, they had to process their entrance in this country in very special way. The War Rights Act was a law that allowed spouses of American military personnel to enter the United States, but Japanese women were excluded. Then there was a brief period in which they were allowed to enter, but then it ended up, and so individual bills had to be organized in order to admit one by one. One person by one person had to have a specific bill in the Congress, and it had to be approved by the Congress, so Japanese women could enter the United States as fiancé or spouses of men in the military, and mainly were men who married Japanese women. As we know, this also created a environment for Japanese women in the United States that did contribute to a life that was very limited in terms of acceptance by the mainstream society. War has always been one factor for men and women to immigrate, and when they are members of the country that has been defeated or which has been blamed for the military actions of the United States, they fall into places that are vulnerable, fragile, or frankly dangerous. There are wars that are imagined also. For example, the competition of entrepreneurs or corporations in the United States with Asian industries. It has also been considered in the United States as part of a war that is assumed to be unfair. Although capitalism does promote the idea that if you have a good product at a good price, you should be free to sell it, or to and you it is the invisible hand, right, of the free market that is going to regulate naturally that those commercial relationships. In the United States, there is a tendency to assume that that Asian industries are always unfair and that they must be kept controlled, which is against the principles of capitalism, as far as I know. And this logic can be very dangerous. For example, in 1982, Vincent Chan, who was a Chinese American engineer celebrating his near marriage, was assassinated, was murdered by Chrysler workers who yelled at him, blaming him for the high levels of unemployment in the United States, for what they thought it was the Japanese unfair competition, right? So again, it was an anti-Asian. They did not distinguish Japanese persons from Chinese persons, and they enacted an anti-Asian logic that was founded on the false notion that they were victims of the Japanese industry success. There are other wars that we can remember, or relations with other countries that have resulted in other expressions of anti-Asian violence. The Iran relationships, for example, the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, and an expression is the application of the Patriot Act, which is invested or was invested in racial profiling. Right, even some persons of Latin American origin have been stopped in different ports of entrance due to their assumed Arabian phenotype, is if there is such a one way of identifying a person from all the countries that were listed as the sources of terrorism. So Asian persons can also be victims of racial profiling. And okay, just to recap, I would like to again reflect on the nature of racism. Racism is structural, is institutional. It is about power and privileges, and it is also access to a safe environment and quality of life based on racial classifications. It is embedded in law, culture, and language. It is naturalized through practices and jokes, and it is intersectional. There are different axes here that we can consider when we examine the different experiences of persons of Asian descent who have been exposed to some kind of discrimination or racial violence. And we also need to reflect on the moral minority myth, because it is a myth. There is nothing natural about any person of Asian descent that fits stereotypes, including what we consider good stereotypes, such as being good at mathematics or playing what we call a classic instrument, musical instrument, and so on. So the moral minority also obscures the fact that there is a large percentage of persons of Asian descent in the United States who endure poverty, who are deprived from access to resources, from access to a high quality of life or education. And anti-Asian racism is not new, but historical. I want to also emphasize that the current attacks against persons of Asian descent are not exceptional. They are historical. They now present different forms, but they are a continuation of the violent acts, the state-sanctioned racism that has been expressed against communities of and individuals or Asian descent. And I want to clarify that Asian Americans or Asian immigrants are not responsible for COVID. And in fact, a large number of Filipino nurses have died as a result of their exposure to COVID while working to control the crisis, the health crisis in the United States. So they are frontline workers in the struggle. And so I would like to invite you to think about what we can do to stop anti-Asian racism. And I would say that working against all forms of racism is also an attempt to stop anti-Asian racism, right? We need to acknowledge other types of racism in the United States and inform ourselves, educate ourselves about this particular expression of racism, do get proper training on how we can avoid situations that can culminate in this severe damage of the bodies and lives of persons of Asian descent, that we can support political representation of persons of Asian descent, and that we should also ask persons of Asian descent, organizations, and individuals, committees, how we can show our support and not impose our ideas of how they should be assisted to control racism in the United States and hopefully to make it disappear. So this is my presentation. I hope I contributed a little bit to reflection. Okay.
We will now transition to the Q&A portion of our session. And please feel free to place your questions down in the Q&A box. When we will then pose each question on to Dr. Chew as we receive the questions. I see that there is a few questions, so I'm going to get started with that. The first question that came in, Dr. Chew, says, did Asian American immigrants face discrimination in El Paso from white and Hispanic communities?
I couldn't hear you.
Oh, no, that's okay. It says, did Asian American immigrants face discrimination in El Paso from the white and Hispanic communities?
Okay, thank you for the question. Definitely, we do. We do face racism and discrimination um, from other social sectors in the borderlands. In El Paso, the jokes, for example, about chinitos. To begin with, let's start with the infantilization, right, of persons of Asian descent. To call a Chinese man or an Asian man in general chinito is already an infantilization that is not tolerated by African American communities, because it does deprive persons of their full humanity, maturity. Stereotypes to call a Korean person, a Vietnamese person, a Chinese person, a Japanese person, all of them chinitos, is also discrimination. I have heard comments, horrible comments against Chinese persons in lines while I am shopping. The other person think that I do not understand Spanish, and then they start making horrible comments against persons of Chinese or Asian descent in general, because they don't, as I said, there is not a distinction of ethnicities. So definitely there is discrimination. There are ideas that affect our employability, our social mobility, our safety too. Although it's not violent as we can learn. It is in California and New York. There is still the danger of it because of all these stereotypical ideas and dehumanization of persons of Asian descent. I hope I answered this question.
No, it was perfectly answered. Thank you, Dr. Chew. Another question that just came in was, how do we find our voice in fighting Asian hate in today's increasing volatile society?
That's also an important question, and it's personal, and at the same time is communal or community social question or process, right? Information, so we can introduce that information into the conversations in which these stereotypes are reproduced, or into places that are hosting or creating decisions that are going to affect the quality of life of persons of Asian descent. So information, education, respect, always thinking that every person of Asian descent is different, even different within a family. We all are different, phenotypically, intellectually, ideologically, and intellectually, I don't mean hierarchies, right? But in terms of our intellectual interest, right? Or ideas, ideology, religion, etc. So think about persons of Asian descent on individual basis, what your personal relationship can be to them, and also about their history. For example, when there is war between countries, the persons who immigrate probably are in disagreement with the country that is considered enemy of the United States at that particular moment. Yet they're blamed for the decisions taken by their governments. And that is not fair. That is not fair. Just disassociate those ideas. Get to know the person. Get to know their ideas. Get to know the reasons, if there are any, for them to immigrate into the United States.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chew. I believe, unless anyone else has any other questions, we do have one. I can shorten it up, but she was just saying if there's any internal organizations that could offer help to the Asian American communities, I guess, who are suffering through this discrimination at the moment, if there's any current organizations.
Right, the AAPI, I think it is I don't remember exactly the names I belong, but there are several organizations, and you just have to search Asian American Pacific Islander organizations. And I think that I omitted a very important aspect of anti-Asian violence, which is the, I did mention it because of the Japanese and Korean Chinese immigration to Hawaii, but Pacific Islanders are in very vulnerable positions because the islands tend to be colonized. And although Pacific Islanders are at times, or different Pacific Islanders are part of the United States, they do hold citizenship or some type of civic rights in the United States, because they are in indigenous populations and because of their colonizing relationship to the United States or other countries or states, they have to face state violence, and they also have to face stereotypes, popular culture that dehumanizes them and that places them in very, very inferior positions in the United States when they migrate in the nation that is supposed to have annexed their territory and granted them some kind of citizenship, right? So PI is the acronym that we can look for in order to find different strategies and information. For sure, there are plenty, and even in Facebook there are different also groups that are very informal, but at the same time can be the channels for you to integrate into more formally organized associations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chew. I believe that's all the time we have at the moment, and I would